thanks very much for coming to spend an evening with me. The topic of the talk tonight is how to take the business along on the journey with us. And that's something that I think lots of people kind of skip over with horrible consequences. I made that mistake myself a couple of years ago, last time, when I was a CTO of a company. There was a relatively young startup, and we were kind of well funded for a period of time, and we had fantastic technical practices that allowed us to burn through that cash like crazy. And when we spent all the money, we pretty much spent it at the worst possible time in the last 20 years to look for investment. That was kind of summer 2009, and I realized that although we've done a lot of incredibly good things technically, we've kind of completely messed up in trying to figure out what to do from a business perspective and, you know, engaging our business users in any sensible way. And this is where I think a lot of companies these days just kind of miss out on a fantastic potential we have. Over the last 10, 15 years, there's been a huge improvement, a massive improvement in the way how we deliver software. And lots of organizations that I work with as a consultant have reasonably good technical practices. And they have an incredible amount of potential there. There's kind of, most teams these days can deliver software every couple of weeks or kind of even several times a day. And there's very few organizations that actually benefit from that. And I think that that's a completely missed opportunity. So hopefully, you know, I can give you some ideas, some tools and tricks and techniques how you can kind of play a couple of Jedi mind tricks on your business users and actually get the organizations to benefit from, you know, your capability. And this is where I think a lot of it is, you know, we're to blame for a lot of this disconnect. And I think in retrospect, when, you know, the whole thing failed in 2009, I realized that a lot of what we've done in the organization has pretty much been similar to what my friend Nick was doing when we were in high school. So before mobile phones and stuff like that, when we wanted to go out, we'd have lots of negotiations up front because that was difficult to do without, you know, mobile phones. And then we'd all go and, you know, wait for Nick, average kind of 45 minutes every time we went out. Nick was always the last person to arrive. And without mobile phones, you couldn't even call him and shout at him and, you know, swear and stuff like that. So you'd have to wait for him to appear. And the reason why kind of Nick was always late is on his way out of, you know, his room, there was a narrow corridor, and in there he had a mirror for his kind of shoes. And as he was trying to get out, we observed this once, so it's completely verified. He just kind of stopped near to the mirror and started checking out shoes, and then check out some other shoes and check out some other shoes. And he'd spent about half an hour checking out lots of different types of shoes. Now, the rationale behind this, and, you know, this was his explanation, was that if he only had the right type of shoes, he'd get played that night. And that never ever happened. The reason why not is that his choice of shoes pretty much didn't matter because Nick was as ugly as a cave troll. And I think, you know, from many perspectives, this is exactly what we've done with that startup. We took a very small mirror, we pointed it at a part of the process that we liked very much, and then spent a lot of time improving that. And kind of, nobody really noticed the troll face that was there, and nobody wanted to look at it, but actually that hurt us quite a lot at the end. So what we've done is we've improved the technical delivery practices quite significantly, but we left the business picture completely outside the whole thing. And instead of trying to deal with that problem, we were kind of congratulating ourselves for being able to deliver 5 times a day, where what we were delivering was complete crap. And you know, I don't think we were an isolated case there, because if you look at the statistics of what people tend to do with Agile these days, for example, Forrester Research published a paper a couple of years ago on how companies adopt Agile, and they said that the most popular agile process out there by far is water scrum fall. Which means kind of make all the business decisions up front, then you children can go and play a scrum as much as you want. And then at the end, we're going to wait for the thing to marinate and improve, and when we're ready, we'll take that. And this pretty much means that the organization around the software delivery is not really benefiting from the fact that people can deliver every 2 weeks. We've taken a very small mirror, we've pointed it at, I don't know, software development and stuff, but even when, people do adopt Agile, it's very often, we've done it for programming. Who cares? Is anybody actually benefiting from that? So, from that perspective, I think that's a massively missed out opportunity, and what a lot of people think about when they talk about, we're doing Agile, we're doing this, we're doing that, we think about that kind of, we have a really fast car, we're going to drive it somewhere, and lots of people tend to equate fast with good. And, there's lots of cases where fast and faster isn't necessarily better, right? We have a lot of crap being delivered, a lot of crap being kind of processed through the whole thing. And I think if I look at a lot of my clients that are kind of relatively large organizations, fair enough, software people can do a lot of stuff faster, but it's just kind of like, feeding people McDonald's. So if you try and look at the way most organizations I work with integrate with the business and what they collect, what they declare as victory, what we talk about when we try and engage with the business, we try and show them, we've done this stuff, we've tested it, and people get shown something like this. And, there's no business user ever that can look at something like this and have even an opinion on it, apart from, why is this thing red? Can you make it go green? And then people tend to optimize completely wrong stuff. That's where people get policies like, we have to have 99% test coverage, and people then end up writing tests as cert true just to bring up test coverage and things like that, which is a completely wasted opportunity. Now, the other thing that people tend to do, and we've done this quite a lot, is we find some really interesting statistics to prove, we're winning. And you start putting it up in dashboards like this that move around, and they're all brilliant, and there's pie charts, and there's kind of stuff that move, and then somebody says, you have 10,000 violations in the system. Why is that? How do we solve that? And people start optimizing really weird stuff, and then we start saying, technical debt, and so a lot of it doesn't make any sense, unfortunately. And we need to, if we're actually going to get organizations to benefit from the fact that people can deliver more frequently and that we can do this stuff in 2 weeks or 3 weeks, we need to start completely changing our integration points there. We need to start changing what we report, we need to start changing what we measure, and we need to start kind of avoiding explaining victories through something like this. Doug Hubbard wrote an absolutely fantastic book on business metrics called How to Measure Anything. And when I read that book, my brain exploded when I read a sentence that completely explained everything wrong I've been doing for 10 years. And there's a fantastic sentence there that says, and he's not approaching this from a software perspective, he's approaching it from a business metrics perspective. And he said that in most organizations, people measure what's easy to measure, not what's important. This is exactly that. As teams move to shorter delivery phases, we're starting to move much more towards a continuous delivery model, where we can ship stuff to production much more frequently. Don't know, 10 years ago, whenever I spoke to people about how frequently they ship stuff to production, it was typically measured in months. If you went into a bank and said, can you ship every 2 weeks, they think you're crazy. Where pretty much a lot of teams in banks I work with these days technically have the potential of shipping every 2 weeks. They would have it even faster, but the organizations won't let them. So a lot of it is, again, not necessarily the best fulfilled potential we have. And sometimes, that can even start causing a lot of problems. I've worked with a team at a bank where, they were really, really happy about being able to ship every 2 weeks and stuff like that. When we spoke to developers there, when they talked about continuous delivery and things like that, the picture they had in their mind was something like Amazon Prime. I know kind of New Zealand is outside of Amazon's reach very often, but when people think about continuous delivery, that's what we think about. It's kind of, you know, we can ship stuff quickly, we can give stuff to people as soon as they want it, we are very quick, we release stuff, but when you went and talked to their business users, the picture they were actually seeing is like, oh, I have to relearn everything again, you know, they completely broke this screen, now I can't, you know, the reports have changed, now the other stuff has changed as well. Like, a lot of the times, you know, and this is what I used to do as well, kind of, we force our users to take stuff that they don't want. At this point, continuous delivery is actually bad. It's not achieving what we want to achieve. And there's another really interesting perspective, even not for banks, and kind of, you know, where we look at consumer software and things like that, where the short releases that we started doing now actually have quite a significant impact on business that very few people consider. And that's kind of releases start messing up your marketing strategy. And that's something that, you know, very, very few businesses consider, where, for example, there's Tesla is celebrated for this kind of new way of fixing the car industry, where all of a sudden you have a computer on wheels, and they're beating their competition, they're, you know, opening up new business models, they're doing over-the-air updates and things like that. But then the choice of release strategy actually has quite a significant impact on marketing and what we can do with marketing, and it can cause some really, really unforeseen business problems. For example, there was a guy called Robert Wolpert in the States who bought a Tesla car, and when Tesla came up with an over-the-air update for something they called an autopilot for one of their newer models, Robert Wolpert actually went furious and started complaining that the car he bought 5 years ago is not getting the autopilot, and started a petition to kind of petition Tesla to start backporting stuff that his hardware doesn't support. So this is like, you know, asking Apple to go and fix a non-3G mobile phone with a 3G chip just because you're entitled to that, because, say, you know, there's a new model coming out. So although we no longer, you know, it's ridiculous to start thinking about backporting hardware incompatible updates, because Tesla is approaching their car as a continuous improvement thing, people all of a sudden feel entitled to that. And that starts creating marketing problems where, you know, newspapers start writing about this as, oh, you know, people are getting shafted by Tesla and things like that. It's crazy, it's absolutely crazy. And very often teams don't even consider that the choice of the deployment strategy can have serious marketing impacts. For example, I'm working on a tool that's actually kind of one of my pet projects now, and it's starting to become relatively serious. We are starting to get lots and lots of users on it, but what we realize is that our choice of a deployment strategy completely messed up a lot of marketing potential. So we choose to be able to deliver 10 times a day, just because technically we can. And what that meant is that pretty much we've not been able to use some of the kind of most important marketing strategies. So this is our curve of growth for the last 2 years. And you can see a couple of interesting bumps over there. This is the number of users using the system. So this bump over there was us announcing version 1.0. Big news announcement. We were on the homepage of Hacker News for a whole day. We were on the homepage of Reddit. Lots and lots of people came. This thing over there is we announced that we're open sourcing the tool. A couple of people kind of wrote about that. Some newspapers published articles about that. We got a nice bump. This thing over there is an announcement that we started doing collaboration and things like that. And after that, we pretty much were never able to repeat a bump like that. And the reason why we were never able to repeat a bump like that is that we have a continuous stream of things coming out of production. There's never anything that's so newsworthy that we can get a popular news site to write about it. We were able to kind of pull it off by saying, oh, it's 1.0, but it's actually been there for a long time. So the choice of the deployment strategy we made had a significant impact on what we can do with marketing and things like that. And that's something that a lot of teams don't even consider in terms of how we're going to do stuff. So one of the kind of really interesting things to start considering if we're going to bring the business along for the journey is actually get marketing people in charge of releases. And if we get marketing people in charge of releases, what we're going to do is they'll immediately kind of stop force feeding stuff, and that would mean that we're not going to be allowed to deploy 8 times a day, which is kind of bad, because there's lots of benefits of being able to deploy 8 times a day every 2 weeks, although the marketing, the organization around us might not be ready to accept that software, or the users might not be ready to accept that software. So there's a whole conflict there between what we can do technically and what would be good for the company as kind of marketing. So one really, really interesting idea that Jez Humble promotes in his new book, Lean Enterprise, is that if we really want to get the business engaged, what we need to do is we need to decouple and we need to break the connection between a release and a deployment. For most software teams out there, a release and deployment are the same thing, where kind of Jez Humble advises being able to decouple those two things, so we can release whenever we're ready to release, in terms of, hey, the organization around us is ready to accept more software, or our users can accept more software, or the marketing guys decide now would be a really good time to push things out. At the same time, we should be able to kind of de-risk technical stuff with deploying 8 times a day. And in order to do those two things, there's a couple of things we need to start changing conceptually in terms of how we design software, how we develop software, how we approach kind of anything we do with that. So one critical thing to kind of think about is your release strategy and your deployment strategy tied closely together? If so, what's tying it together? What are the technical constraints of that? What are the marketing constraints? And how do we break this apart? And one of the most important things that I've realized we have to do, and we have to do for kind of removing that stuff, is if we're really going to start decoupling the marketing act of releasing software and the technical act of deploying to production, we need to start pretty much multi-versioning everything. Because in order to be able to kind of deploy something and not have to get users to experience that, I need to be able to run multiple versions of my user interface, multiple versions of the backend services, multiple versions of lots of different things. Now, once we started doing this, an amazing set of business opportunities opened up that I never really imagined. Once we did this, we were able to give 1% of our users a new version of the software and get some really good feedback from that. We were able to release really, really risky stuff only to low-risk territories. We were able to run lots of interesting experiments at the same time and measure different things in production rather than kind of trusting that we have a really good opinion about something and it's going to work. So moving away from kind of decoupling release and deployment opens up some really interesting business possibilities, and then business people wake up to this and start really kind of joining us in this journey. One of the best stories about this is from Google, and it's called the 40 Shades of Blue. It has nothing to do with 50 Shades of Grey, although, you know, it might be interesting to look at parallels there. And somewhere in 2009, Google's director of design, so a pretty serious kind of business guy there, came up with the idea to change the color on the advertisement links on the Google homepage. And this was put in as a requirement. It kind of started going through the pipeline, and when it hit the pipeline, some people in development said, well, how do we test this? Kind of, yeah, I can test it and change the color, but that's a technical thing. You know, let's get, what's the business perspective of this? Why are we doing this from a business perspective? And at this point, they tried kind of asking that question, and the head of design said, well, you know, if you change the color to a more pleasant color, what's going to happen is people are going to click on more ads. They're going to spot these ads, they're going to click on more ads. And because Google had multi-versioning, because Google had a separation of release and deployment, what they were able to do is actually test this assumption. Not in terms of, hey, you know, we're going to release it and we're going to hope it works. What they were able to do is kind of do this, deploy it to 1% of their users, run it as a test, and in order to kind of run it as a relevant test, what they actually did is they tested 40 different colors of blue. And what they've done is they've proven that the color that the head of design chose was actually performing much worse than the current one, and multiplied to 100% of the users, multiplied to 365 days, the difference in performance was about $250 million. You know, it was live for an hour on 1% of our users. We're not actually going to release this. And in anger, their head of design quit. So kind of they saved $250 million plus a salary of an overpaid designer, which is kind of, yeah, hey. What is that? They were able to do this, and they were able to kind of turn the IT capability in a competitive advantage. They were able to, you know, drive their business decision making from this, which is incredibly powerful. So the other component of this, if we are going to kind of do multi-versioning and run multiple things in production, decouple the act of deployment from releasing, is we need to start thinking a lot differently about when are we ready to release. And if we're going to start kind of thinking about, well, you know, I'm ready to release 8 times a day, I'm ready to release every week, I'm ready to release every 3 months, what does that actually mean? Because for a lot of organizations, especially those that are stuck in what is Scrum 4, I'm ready to release means, well, it's been on the testing environment for 3 weeks. Nobody's been complaining for more than 5 days, and kind of, we ran out of time, so yeah, kind of release it. And that thing doesn't really work if we want to kind of split those two things. So we need to start coming up with a much more objective criteria for what does it mean to be okay to deploy, so that, hey, you know, there's these multiple versions in production, and we can get marketing people to say, well, you know, we want this version to 10% of our users, we want this version to 100%, and things like that. This is where another technique that Google is kind of famous for is really, really interesting, and I think it's going to be critical for a lot of companies as, you know, they start doing this. And this is coming up with an objective definition of when are we ready to deploy. And they're approaching this from a perspective of a shared agreement on how much risk we are ready to take in production. And that's an interesting kind of perspective, because every time you deploy new software, you are potentially exposing yourself to some risk. And testing is there to de-risk this. Now, how much do we need to de-risk it? There's some kind of business value in being able to deliver faster. In that case, you might want to accept more risk. And there's some business value in being able to de-risk things more or less, and nobody really has a good conversation with that. So, in a book called How Google Tests Software, James Whittaker describes a technique they call an attribute component capability matrix that kind of is a lot more complex than I can explain in this talk, but you know, the book is a nice reference for that. What that allows them to do is have a good conversation with the business users on how much risk individual capabilities carry, get them to vote on that. So it's not a technical opinion, it's a business opinion, how much risk certain capabilities carry. And then what they can do is they can prove through testing how much they are de-risking these things. And they have a couple of really interesting visualizations. This is one visualization where their system components are on the top. Their system attributes, stuff that business people care about, are on this dimension. And the depth is how much risk the current version of software carries. Now, the more testing they do, the more these holes fill up. And then they can have a good discussion about, well, when there's nothing risk level 10, we are ready to deploy to production, or we are ready to deploy to 1% of our users, or we are ready to deploy to lots of. So once we have multi-version in place, we can do these things where we can actually set objective stages of when are we done to go to, dog fooding, or 1%, or 5%, or deploying to a low-risk territory, and things like that. And then we can really have an interesting discussion of, well, how much testing do we need to do, and what kind of testing do we need to do? So we don't report anymore, hey, we have 67.35% coverage on this Java module. Who cares? Do we have any risk level 10 items that are still uncovered? And things like that. So, in a couple of places where we started using the ACC matrix, it's opened up some really, really interesting discussion on how much testing is enough, where do we invest our money in testing, how frequently do we need to test certain things, and how much do we need to cover. And it really started a discussion on, what does it actually mean to be a priority one bug? One of the critical things that, where there's a lot of disconnect and that causes what has come fall is, testing is pretty much a technical opinion. For a lot of people, testers measure stuff, they say, oh, there's no priority one bug anymore, or we have 300 priority 3 problems and things like that. Nobody really knows what that means. That's, testers invented priority 1, 2, and 3 and things like that. And very often business people see some benefit in releasing more frequently. They want some features earlier, and somebody makes a decision, oh, it needs to go to production. I do not care if it has problems. And then it goes to production, and then 5 minutes later, that person is screaming at you because there's a problem he wasn't really expecting. And things like this is where there's a huge disconnect between what quality means for technical people and what quality means for business people. This is a technique that allows us to actually have a good conversation about that. And the first time when we tried to do something like this, we were hired by a company in London that wanted to start releasing software every 2 weeks, and they had about 3 weeks of testing they had to do for every release. So you can't really fit in 3 weeks of testing into a 2-week deployment cycle and actually do anything there. You have -1 weeks. So I've not yet heard anybody do negative time development. So we started talking to people about, unless you want to throw out half of your testing, this is not even useful to start, but let's think about which half we need to throw out, which 2/3 we need to throw out. And maybe we start thinking about this not from a technical perspective, but from a business perspective. So make sure we cover all the important risks and stuff like that. And fair enough, you deploy more frequently, you can cover risks differently. Maybe you're not going to cover all the risks, but maybe some of those risks are acceptable in production for the benefit of deploying more frequently. And they said, no, the business people are never going to accept that. I said, well, testing is an insurance policy. Testing is never done. It's only stopped. And you stop it at some point depending on how much excess you want on your insurance policy. You can cover 100% of the risk, but it's going to cost too much. So you have to accept some excess there so you can pay less. None of the business people are never going to accept that. And the interesting thing about this is this was an insurance company. When we went to the business guys and talked about insurance policies and excess and things, that they loved it. They said, look, I can finally figure out what's going on. So we were able to create an ACC matrix for these guys, and as a result, they threw out about 90% of the tests. They rewired the 10% of the time they were left with, they were proving real business risks. And as this allowed them to start releasing much more frequently and deploying much more frequently, they were not introducing that much risk, so everybody was happy with this. But the only way they could do that is have a good conversation about risk from a business perspective and then have an objective definition of when are we ready to release, when are we ready to deploy. So, from another perspective, this thing allows us to now start doing deliveries much more frequently and doing not just deliveries, but actually doing releases much more frequently. And this is where business people really start getting engaged. if they are in charge of release versus deployment, and pretty much we deploy frequently, so we de-risk the technical stuff, they can de-risk the business stuff. What I've seen people start to do is actually use this as a competitive advantage. Use this to start measuring stuff that was incredibly costly to measure earlier, and to do some very cheap measurements about it, like Google did, where, hey, you want to change the color. Previously, we'd have to trust you, but now we're going to measure it. And this thing opens up so many interesting business possibilities. So another thing that I've seen this thing open up is business people get engaged a lot more into defining what needs to be tested. And this is where we can start approaching requirements slightly differently. We can start approaching requirements not as a God-given, do this or else. We can start approaching requirements as, hey, it costs so little to try this out in production. Let's just, bet on this and try it. If it works, it works. If it doesn't work, who cares? We're gonna, we have the technical capability of checking it with 1% of the users on a low-risk system or something like that. And this is where what I've seen people start to do is starting to tie up really, really interesting things. So, for example, most people start approaching kind of iterations and user stories and things that, it has to be small to fit into an iteration. What business people hear about there is blah, 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 technical stuff. I'm going to wait for everything to come out at the end in my, fall of water scrum fall and take it live because I don't care. But what we can start doing now is we can start tying these things back to kind of business goals. We can start saying, you have this business goal, and that business goal kind of, there's a couple of business changes we can do, and in order to do that, well, we have these kind of potential epics, and we have these potential kind of stories, but it costs so little to test one of these things out in prod that you don't necessarily have to wait for everything to come out. Like, how do we give you quick feedback? What do you want to get quick feedback on? How do we support people making business decisions around this? And this is where some really, really interesting opportunities open up. Because very often, kind of the water scrum fall problem is because people like to be precise. They like to be confident in what they want to do. So they like to spend 6 months doing requirements and doing nothing else. Of course not. Kind of the reason why people spend 6 months doing requirements is it costs so much to be wrong. So they de-risk that by spending a lot of time making sure that they're right. Now, if being wrong doesn't cost that much, that problem is gone. And we can just kind of start thinking about, well, there's these things here, these things there. If we can measure this stuff for you, let's do, a couple of ideas there, let's try it out, and let's see what comes out. What we can start rewiring testing to be is a lot more kind of, hey, you told us you expect people to click on the links more. They're not clicking. And I think that's where the role of testing is going to start changing in the future. That's how we can start taking the business on the journey and benefiting from the fact that we can roll things out faster, rather than saying, hey, I have 700 tests, 500 are failing, 3 are passing. What do we do? Which 3 are failing? Which 3 are passing, which 700 are failing? If the 700 that are failing are low-risk business experiments and the 3 that are passing are very, very high-risk transaction stuff, deploy. Or, if I have 999 tests that are passing, but one that is kind of, that's exactly the link thing that we wanted to prove, and that one is failing, well, maybe we shouldn't really release that stuff, and we can start thinking about that from a completely different perspective. And this thing opens up some really, really interesting possibilities. So, for example, we had this thing where we were trying to get one of our last milestones for this kind of collaboration tool I've been working on is we were really struggling to double our number of users. And we implemented a ton of really interesting user stories, and the number of users was kind of growing slightly. And then what we've done is we had this weird experiment where we added one camel case word to a config file, and all of a sudden, this thing happened. And the number of users more than doubled because there was one common case word in a config file. And what that actually did is, we had an angry email from a university admin somewhere around that time over there that said, how could you be so stupid to kind of require me to approve 700 accounts? I have no idea what you're talking about, but let's explore this a bit more. So, well, I have 700 requests from my students to use your tool, and because you're not supporting this whole kind of just install it to the entire domain, I have to go through all these emails and click on approve every time. How stupid could you be? And this was a point where I realized that, there's a completely new use for our software that we never imagined. And we built this thing to be nicely integratable with Google Drive. And kind of students use Google Drive at universities. We really kind of, never really explored that. And the thing that this guy was fighting with is, when you start using an app that uses Google Drive, a dialog comes up and says, hey, would you like to allow this app to access your Google Drive? You click on yes, the dialog goes away, that's brilliant. I've not been a student for kind of 20-something years, so I haven't really used Google Drive at university. Apparently, if you want to use Google Drive at university, the process is not like that. The process is you say yes, but then it goes to somebody else to approve. And it goes to this poor guy that overnight got 700 requests. So basically, there's a config file you can change to tell Google that if this guy says approve, it's globally approved, and then people don't even have to request it, they can just use it. And once we did that, the number of users kind of increased quite significantly. So we were basically at the point where we were struggling for 2 months to increase the number of users, which was kind of the business goal we had and kind of the customer impact. And we did a ton of stuff here. We'd never really achieved that part on top. But we found something completely different that actually achieved that thing. And we were able to exploit that and benefit from that kind of completely new business opportunity that opened up, because we were focused on delivering the stuff on the top, not the stuff on the bottom. The stuff on the bottom is, hey, one option of getting there. And this is where we can start thinking about really, really interesting things where, we just stopped our milestone. We threw out 200 more user stories that we had prepared, because they're no longer relevant. We achieved what we wanted to achieve with the config file. And this is where, the business side of things is really benefiting from the capability of the software team to stop and replan and do something that's crazy, like release to 1% of the users and increase, so kind of replan quickly. And this is where the whole water scrum fall thing starts falling apart. Once there's a tie-in among kind of the stuff you can technically deliver and some business goals that you can measure, and the testing thing is more focused on the stuff at the top than at the bottom, business can benefit from, hey, here's a new business opportunity that came up during delivery. So, do you really want to do a water scrum fall thing where you've made all your decisions 6 months up front, and then if something comes along, you can't really benefit from that because we've committed to delivering this stuff? Or do you want the flexibility of exploiting new things that come along? So I've never ever talked to a manager that said, no, we don't want the flexibility of taking new business opportunities. Don't worry about that. So in terms of getting business people along and getting them to benefit from the technical capabilities, I think another thing we need to start doing as software people is repositioning testing. And repositioning testing from, hey, we're going to check for consistency and compliance with the requirements, to, hey, let's measure some business goals, let's measure some impacts and figure out what's really happening there. So, those are some really interesting things that open up once we start decoupling release from deployment, once we start repositioning when are we ready to go live, once we start kind of decoupling a decision of releasing with some agreed measurements of risk, that people have agreed on, so we don't have to argue anymore what's a priority one, what's a priority two, and whether, you can release to prod, and I'm not going to push here, I'm not going to kind of complain, but then people complain a minute later, because we can have a global agreement and stuff like that. So that's kind of an interesting option to have. So one technique we use for this quite a lot is impact mapping, where we can start creating a visual connection between technical deliveries, user stories, epics and things like that, to kind of changes in the business we expect to see. And then kind of what are the business goals, what are the targets we're trying to achieve with that. Jeff Patton, who is a kind of legend in the Agile product management community, says that the objective of software companies shouldn't be to deliver more software. It should be to kind of change the world with the least amount of software possible. So the fact that we can ship stuff out doesn't mean we should. And the fact that we can release 20 times a day doesn't mean we should. We should be able to change our users' behavior, change and achieve some business impacts and stuff with the least amount of software possible. And the only way we can do that is being able to kind of reposition testing to something more logical. So using a technique like impact mapping or something that we can get business people to start engaging with us and actually get a nice set of ideas that can contribute to some business changes, and also get a good perspective of what people actually want to try and achieve. The magic of impact mapping is kind of in this part here, and that's kind of the impact of the change on somebody. The idea with impact mapping is that it's very, very difficult to prioritize or argue whether one report is more important than another report, or whether this tick box is more important than that back office service, because business people can't give you an opinion on that. What they can compare and what they can give us an opinion on are changes in the way how customers interact with us, or changes in the way our users work and things like that. And this is what we can actually start measuring and reporting on. This is what people at Google did when they said, well, people are going to click more on this link. That's a change, that's an impact on somebody, and we can actually go and measure that. And what impact mapping does is it connects technical deliveries to kind of assumptions like that gives everybody the perspective of what we actually need to measure. And then we can start figuring out what's the best possible, what's the fastest, what's the shortest way of measuring that stuff. What that also gives, and I've seen this effect many, many times, once we start restructuring our backlogs, once we start restructuring our software plans in this way, people get lots of interesting ideas. What would be a good thing to push to production is a very simple thing. Because anything you can do to kind of cause fewer exceptions is still good. As soon as you have something ready for that, that's ready to go live. And we can start changing the whole conversation about what has come forward, having to wait for everything to come out, by saying, hey, we've done these three things, that can cause fewer exceptions. Because we have it multi-versioned, we have deployed it, it's up to you to release it if you want. And I challenge you to find somebody who's going to say, no, we actually don't want to cause fewer exceptions, that's okay. So that can kind of start changing the whole conversation. So those are kind of some interesting tools and techniques. So have a look at impact mapping, have a look at the ACC matrix, have a look at kind of starting to multi-version things, because that's really important to unlock stuff. And multi-versioning is one of those weird things where people are going to say, maybe, yo, this will never possibly work in our environment, but that's a technical problem. And if you can pull it off, you have reduced a business problem into a technical problem, and then it's up to us to have a technical solution to that, which is kind of a nice thing to deal with. Instead of, reducing technical problems to business problems and causing people to, fight us all the time, we actually can benefit from the technical capability. So that's a couple of things that I mentioned. So as kind of a reminder, here are the things that I can hopefully get you to think about. So first of all, try and decouple the act of releasing from the act of deployment. If you can do that, that opens up so many interesting possibilities. Because then we can start solving the fall part of what is going to fall. And two key things to do that are kind of start multi-versioning everything and try to have kind of a transparent, objective definition of when we are ready to deploy. Not necessarily release. Release is not a technical decision. That's a marketing decision. But when are we ready to deploy? So the next thing is try and reposition testing from measuring features and measuring compliance, measuring compatibility with requirements, to measuring success. And that's a really interesting thing, because then that forces us to start engaging with business users around, well, what does success actually mean? And that leads to defining impacts, defining victories and things like that. And then we go back to what Jeff Patton said, where our aim should never be to deploy too much software. It should be to achieve success with the least amount of software possible. We should think about delivering impacts. So that's about it. Thank you very much for spending an hour of your life with me. I hope I've inspired you to explore some of these new techniques. That's pretty much it. We're ready for alcohol now.